used technology terms in the world. And before I get started on that, I have a disclaimer. I work for the Cloud Foundry Foundation, so I have a bias. So a lot of my examples will be from Cloud Foundry. But the reason that I'm at the Cloud Foundry Foundation is because I think we're at a pivotal moment. If we don't make sure that the technology that we're creating, the technology that's available to the entire world, is open source and is accessible to everybody, we're gonna miss half the ingenuity of the human race. We're gonna miss out on some really awesome opportunities. I think we already have them, and we have people creating great things. How many of you would turn around immediately if you left your phone at home? Because we've gotten so used to having the world in our pocket and having access to everything. A few years ago, I was driving down the road with my son, and he said, "Mom, what was my first word?" And I felt like a terrible mother. I was like, "I don't remember." And I said, "But it's okay, I'll look it up when we get home, I wrote it down." And so we drive another mile or two, and he goes, "So Mom, what was my first word?" And I'm like, "Well, we're not home, I can't look it up." He's like, "Well, use your phone." And I was like, "Well, I wrote it on a piece of paper with a pen." So if someone even recommends a book to me, I look up it on Amazon, I ask my friends think, I can follow where my friends are at every point in the world, I can ask them for advice. We can control not just our own lives and our own computers, we can control windmills, we can control poaching in the Amazon forest, all of this through our phones, through the cloud. And it's really important that we make sure that that's accessible to our kids and that they understand what they can create. So right now in the high schools, they're teaching PowerPoint. So my older son went to sign up for computer science in middle school, and I said, "They're just gonna teach you PowerPoint." And he says, "Yeah, I know, but I like computers." And then I saw what they did with PowerPoint. I didn't even know PowerPoint could look like that or create those kinds of music and slideshows. And so imagine if they had taught them cloud computing. Imagine if they taught them that they could use APIs to grab data from Amazon or from Edmunds, Redbook, or from the music playlist that they like. Imagine the mashups that they could make and the things that they could do. Because one of my friends used the API to pull data from Edmunds and search the local classifieds and tell them when there was a good car deal that he could renovate. So just imagine what our kids could do. And just imagine what kids in developing countries or adults in developing countries could do to make their world a better place if we gave them access to this computing power. So this is actually a group in, I think it's Nigeria, it could be Nigeria, Uganda, looking at the Firefox OS phone that Mozilla made. So completely web-based open phone and figuring out how it could impact their lives. And so this world of cloud computing is here, and we're creating awesome things, and I think we just need to make sure that it's available not just to the technology companies, not just to the large companies that can afford 20 or 30 person teams to put the solution together, but that it's available to all of us. And I'm not going to say it's the year of cloud computing, because how many people heard of the year of the Linux desktop? I heard it was the year of the Linux desktop in 2001, when I was bringing the GNOME desktop to HPUX. I heard it was the year of the Linux desktop in 2007, when I went to run the GNOME Foundation. I heard it was the year of the Linux desktop in 2010, when we were doing a lot of mobile work. But I don't think that any of those were wrong. I think trying to define one year that is the year of a technology is not the right way to look at technology. You need to look at the impact that it's having on the world in that given year. So if you look at the Linux desktop, how many people remember OLPC? How many people actually bought one? Gave it to somebody? They had this great program where they were going to bring a laptop to every child in the world for $100. And when they first launched, you could buy 2 laptops for $400. They would send one to you, and they would send one to a kid in a developing country that needed it. So my kids got one, someone else got one. And they didn't succeed in the end in the way that they had. They're still around, they're still working. They didn't succeed with the impact that they could have had, but I do believe that they had a huge impact on the whole netbook, Chromebook industry. But because before they announced that they could make a $100 laptop with open technologies, nobody else was aiming for that. Another impact that they had during all those years of the Linux desktop was the Raspberry Pi. And this is bringing technology into the hands of anybody. You can buy a little Raspberry Pi kit for like $40, I think, and you can create some awesome things with it. So not only can you create a desktop that runs you can attach it to a monitor and a keyboard, and it looks like a computer at that price, But you can also like attach it to your, the quintessential internet on your fridge. You can attach it to a little robot, you can attach it to your car, you can do all sorts of really interesting things to it. And this is something that we've taken to Mexico, have a nonprofit, Kids and Computers, and let the kids there play with it and build cool things. And so there's been a lot of waves over time. And I'm talking like the big waves, like the invention of the wheel, electricity, the internet, which was for me huge. The assembly line is like a wave. So the idea of factory work, and you can work from 9 to 5 or 7 to 7 or whatever, a full day's worth of work. These technology waves don't just affect the technology that we have, they affect the way we live our lives. So because they invented the assembly line, how many of you still feel like you start your work about 9 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, and you work until 5 or 6, which you consider family time? And that's not really the way our world could work these days, but it's a legacy from a wave that came through and transformed society. And I think cloud computing is one of those waves. So the way that we accomplish things, the way that we build things, the way that we put them together is going to change the world. So what you see happening in this next year or two is going to become the new normal for our children. So it's the year of the cloud in the sense that I think we're going to see the impact of bringing cloud to the average person and to bringing cloud to technologies that aren't, to companies that are not technology companies. We're already seeing it. We're seeing people come together. We're seeing companies come together and work together. This is a list of Cloud Foundry Foundation member companies. And what I think is interesting about this, if you look at this, 5 or 6 of them, a handful of them actually take the Cloud Foundry software, which is open source, and they build on it, and they offer services to their customers. The rest of them are all users. So the rest of them are companies that take the Cloud Foundry software and use it within their business to change their business model. And they're across industries. There's financial companies here. If you take a look, there's a broad range of different types of companies. There's competitors in the list, and they're all working together on this open source software that's changing the way they do business. And I'll give a few examples later. But how many people here are familiar with cloud native apps? Is it a term that's familiar to you? How many people are familiar with microservices? So this new way of working in the cloud brings with it a new way of thinking about how you solve your problem with technology. So now you're creating little bits of technology that interact with each other and interact with the world. And if one of them fails, the rest of them go on. And each one of them has access to all of those others. So I think when our kids look at like Amazon, they see like a great big legacy application like we used to build. They think it's Amazon. They don't see that each piece of that, the rating system, the grocery cart, all of those are being updated multiple times a second, and each one of those is independent. So if a company like Amazon can do it in their product, imagine what a school system could do. Imagine what you as individuals working with your friends could do. You could offer up something you have, some data that you have about your house or your neighborhood, or who walks by, or what parties you know about, and that could interact with a whole ecosystem of data and a whole ecosystem of people in a much easier way to consume than Facebook, and to be useful. And so that new way of thinking is what we need to teach people. We need to teach them that things can be scalable at a really massive scale, and that individuals can create applications that are scalable at a massive scale, at a massive size. So this is a picture of the Oktoberfest Hall in Munich. Who wants to guess how much beer they serve during Oktoberfest? A lot. 8 million liters. 8 million liters of beer in this like 1 week festival.
Take one down.
So what we need is that, so I live in a town of 5,000 here in Colorado. How many people are from Colorado? How many people from out of state actually managed to make it here through the snowstorm, our huge snowstorm? So in my town of 5,000 people, there are 2 microbreweries and 1 distillery. So it's obviously a cultural thing. You need to build a world where Whitney, who runs the brewery 3 blocks from my house, can dream at a scale of affecting, if not creating 8 million liters of beer, affecting the lives of 8 million people. And she does a pretty good job. She actually creates fundraisers for the entire town. We have parties in the park to raise money for the Humane Society. She's thinking big, but we need people to think really big. And we need to think that even as a small company, even as an individual, they can be up 24/7 with this new technology. So they don't need a team of 20 to 30 people wearing a pager. They can actually create solutions that run all the time and are available around the world. And they need to think in terms of microservices. So I was brainstorming with a friend of mine that teaches computer science, Heidi Ellis, about how we could build in APIs into a computer science class to involve more people. Because if these middle school students are creating awesome mashups with PowerPoint, I just can't imagine what awesome mashups they would create with a little bit of JavaScript or Python or whatever they wanted to write in, and access to all the APIs that are out there. And right now, when companies use a lot of cloud technologies, they end up having to use a whole bunch of services. So when I started programming, you got your desktop, and maybe you downloaded your programming language. Everything you had was on your desktop. You compiled it, and it ran. Actually, when I started, it was all on a server. You had to go into the lab and use it. But everything was pretty self-contained in your world. Now when someone starts programming, they have to sign up for 3 or 4 different services, GitHub probably to get started. And then once they've signed up to 4 different services, they need to make them work all well together. And when you take this and you say you want to be 24/7, 365 days a year, you end up depending on a lot of different technologies, and you end up with a team of 10, 20, 30 people whose job is to make sure that the infrastructure underneath your application continues to run. And so what we're trying to do at Cloud Foundry, and that we see others doing as well, is on the right you see technologies that have been coming up, awesome open source technologies that do things like containers and schedulers, and companies that are on the leading edge, companies that are leading the charge, have been taking these technologies and putting them together and make them work well together. And as they do that, we are trying to incorporate them into more of a prescriptive model in Cloud Foundry, so that it's available for everybody, even those that don't have a team of people to put that together. So you can just sign up for a service where your app runs, and all of those services underneath are available to you. So I'm going to show you a little demo. I'm not going to walk through the demo. I took this little Hello World script that I made. Actually, I didn't write it. I borrowed the Hello World script. It's like 10 lines long. And I signed into a Cloud Foundry instance, and I pushed my Hello World script out there, and it put it out there in the internet, in the cloud, in a place where anyone could use their web browser to check out my Hello World app. I told it I wanted to scale, so in case all of you in the audience wanted to check out my Hello World app, it wouldn't crash. And I did all this in like half an hour. So if in half an hour, I could create a Hello World app that's available to anyone around the world, no matter how many millions of people try to access it, that's available 24/7, if it goes down, it'll come back up on its own. Imagine what we could do if we offered that to all of not just us in the room, the technologists, but all of our colleagues, all of our children, and all the people in the developing world. If they could, in half an hour, take something that they do or they know and put it out there for everybody. And kind of an interesting note of like how it changes people's lives in different countries. At Mozilla, we were doing interviews of people who might be using Firefox OS phones. And we interviewed someone who was a hairdresser in India. And when she had a client, she would take a picture of their hair after she finished cutting their hair. And then she would wait 3 weeks or 4 weeks or however long you're supposed to go between haircuts. And then she would send them a picture of their haircut and say, would you like to get your haircut again? So people need these solutions. We just need to give them the right tools and tell them what's possible. So as you can see, I pushed my little simple Hello World app, and then I can go to the browser and I can put it up there. And anyone could see my app. I actually think I deleted it like I do all my demos, so you can't actually go there right now. And then I scale it to more users. So if I can do this in half an hour, and granted I know how to write code, so I know how to write my Hello World app, but I learned all the, you could do all the Cloud Foundry stuff in just a half an hour. Imagine what we could be teaching kids in school and what we could be teaching small startups to do without having to hire out all that expertise. So I'm gonna try to skip the rest of this. So I told you I'd give a couple of examples. These are Cloud Foundry examples because they're the ones I know. We just had a conference in Berlin where we had 470 people or so that are using Cloud Foundry show up to talk about it. And one of the examples that our Makuni, a consulting company, gave us is Comic Relief. How many people know Comic Relief? I didn't. It's kind of like it's a big nonprofit charity in the UK, kind of like a Red Cross is here. And Comic Relief does one big fundraiser a year, and they have a 7-hour window in which they raise $1 billion. So they work with the local TV channels, and for that 7-hour window, they talk Comic Relief, push Comic Relief, and they get 800,000 donations in that 7-hour window, $1 billion, up to 400 transactions a minute. And so they need to work all year to make sure that the 7-hour window is up. And they take medicine to babies in developing countries. They do awesome stuff with the money once they've gotten it. And so the small consultancy has actually created, a guy actually created it, Timothy Savage, to help them. And it's a team of like 4 or 5 people, and in a couple days they set them up with Cloud Foundry to be able to process 400 transactions a minute, $1 billion in a 7-hour window. And so a very small team was able to get this nonprofit in a place where they could have a global, scalable, reliable infrastructure. Another example where we see cloud technologies going into areas that are typically not technology companies and typically haven't used technology in the most efficient ways possible is the industrial internet. And GE is one of these players. There was a Harvard Business Review article done on how they've used the cloud to re-innovate their business. But when they did an initial survey of all the software they had, and they had like 139 different software products, of which like less than 25% were profitable. So they went through and said, what can we do? How can we change how we do things? And they ended up creating a product called Predix on top of Cloud Foundry that enables them to continuously innovate, continuously push out new changes in a way that the developers don't have to worry so much about the infrastructure underneath. So their team maintaining the infrastructure is smaller, and the software teams that they have can push out solutions more quickly. And the industrial internet it's kind of the new buzzword. How many people know industrial internet? You didn't know you were going to have to raise your hand so many times during this talk. I was listening to a podcast on the way in. This is things like sensors in the middle of the Amazon that have to monitor where someone's poaching, what the environment looks like, if the river's running. And so these things live out there without a battery charge for several weeks or several months. They need some kind of networking connection back to a station that might be several miles away. GE in particular has been working a lot on things like windmills. So you've seen the great big white windmills. We have some in Colorado, you probably have some where you live. And those windmills can be made much more efficient if you put a lot of sensors on them. Sensors that know how well they're functioning, if they need to be serviced, how much the wind is going. And they see huge leaps in productivity by attaching the internet, basically, through these sensors to all of these different industrial applications, and then feeding all that data back into the cloud and letting people play with that data or letting the system parse through that data. And it's really changing a business where technology was a necessity, but technology wasn't a competitive advantage in any way. And now it is. And this is from a conference I went to a couple of weeks ago, SAP TechEd, and they were showing how the Cloud Foundry has helped many of their customers. So you see things like, reports that used to take 4 hours take 2 seconds. IT being reduced by 80%, which makes IT nervous, but there's lots of work for IT people to do, so no worries. And saving days of planning. So you're seeing the impact of being able to have applications that are scalable, reliable, and use these microservices that are much smaller, much more maintainable, have an impact across businesses. And so this new app-centric world, I don't mean like apps like you have on your phone, but like apps in the sense that they are small microservices that run on the internet, which could be on your phone, is a new way of thinking for people. And it's often challenging. If you're used to writing legacy software applications where your application knows everything about the world it's in, it knows its state, it knows its data, it knows all its dependencies and has it installed in the same place, moving from that huge legacy, I know everything about myself, to a world where you do your task and you pull data from other places and you query the world to find out what its state, is a hard transition for people. It's a hard transition for normal humans. And it creates this new culture that we call continuous integration. So we see in companies, in this new model, you have to continuously innovate new ideas, continuously deliver. I think Amazon rolls out their website like multiple times per second. So that website is always changing if you hit refresh. You probably can't see what it is, but it's changing. And then they have to continuously integrate all the new code that they're writing. And everyone knows how to think about new ideas. Most software shops have figured out how to integrate the new ideas into the code. Where it gets hard is the delivery part. Updating your website, putting out the new stuff, making sure you've tested it, making sure that the security team is happy with it. And so what we see is people fall into what we call the water scrum fall. For those of you that are used to software development, which is the waterfall model, and the scrum method, which is agile, this is the water scrum fall. It looks kind of like this. One of my kids really puzzled over this, like, why was I supposed to do this picture, and why had somebody did this? And so we see the new cloud model as helping to solve that problem. So if you take these cloud native applications, which are microservices in containers, reliable, scalable, and combine that with this continuous delivery of ideas that companies have, that's when you can really create this new world. And it's a new world that's ephemeral, scalable, agile. People and individuals and companies can move quickly. And it runs in what we call this cloud, this internet. It supports a whole multitude of devices, so you no longer have to worry if people are holding iPhones or Androids, or if they're on Mac, or if they're on Linux. And it connects still to all of the legacy data that big companies might have through APIs. And it's changing our culture, and I think we need to make a culture change to make it happen. So Melvin Conway, one of the fathers of computer science, said that any organization that defines a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of that structure's communication structure. So however you communicate in your organization, if you go to create something, you're going to create something that looks like that. So if you have your developers on one side, your IT on one side, your data on another, your end product is going to also communicate that way. And so if we're looking for small mobile applications, then we need to have small mobile teams. And so I believe I've talked about Amazon, I believe it's an Amazon person who came up with the 2-pizza team model. So any team that cannot be fed by 2 pizzas is too big. And this really depends on who's on your team, because if you have my youngest son, you could have a 2-person team with a 2-pizza team. But the idea is that you have probably a 4 to 7-person team, and that way you create something that's small enough to be agile. It's small enough that it needs to interact with others to get its data. It doesn't do everything itself. And it creates this culture of DevOps, where you have developers and operators working together, not huge teams of operators maintaining an infrastructure that huge teams of developers rely on. You get the developers and the operators working together. And then that creates this mentality that we should all have, and that we should push to our kids, to our friends, this idea that you should be able to say, here's my source code, run it in the cloud for me, I don't care how. So when I wrote my little Hello World app that ran on the web browser, I didn't ask the system that I logged into, so how are you pushing my app, and what database are you going to use, and what infrastructure? You shouldn't have to worry about that. You as an application developer, or you as a small business owner that wants to create an application, you should be able to create the functionality that you want, and then just hand it over, and it should automatically be 24/7 and reliable. And that hasn't been possible until this year, maybe last year. So that's, if there's a year of the cloud, it's this change that we can rely on that. And it's also competitors working together, individuals working together in an open source fashion. We're seeing a lot of open source software projects. The whole stack is open source to support this. So this is like Linux, right? Linux was a huge game changer because it brought a lot of individuals and a lot of companies together, or a lot of penguins for a picture. And so we see these companies working together, and they're creating an entire stack. So you can use open source hardware, you can use open source databases, you can use open source across the entire stack, which really means that anyone can participate and anyone can depend on it without worrying that they have to pay a provider or that they have to depend on a company. When I speak in Europe, people are actually really worried about depending on one US company. Like, that actually makes them really worried. There's just an example they have in mind. But they don't want to base their whole business on depending on a product from one US company. In this open source model, all of that dependency is spread out among a lot of different companies. And what I think is interesting about this slide is that these logos are all logos from projects. If I had put this slide up 10 years ago, all of these would have been logos from companies. And now they're all logos of projects that have lots of companies participating in them. So the world has already changed. And we see big companies saying that this is helping them. It's helping prevent vendor lock-in. And it's creating a whole new era that we get to shape the way we want to. We can, we need to be aware if we pick like the assembly line, what impact we're having for decades ahead of us on the 9-to-5 schedule. We're bringing the internet to everything, not just to our refrigerators, but to large windmills, to our shoes. Like everything is going to be plugged in to this internet, and that data is going to be available for people to create really awesome things. Things from people from our middle schoolers up to people running small businesses. And that's causing us to shift our behavior. And our businesses are going to match the things that we create are going to match what our human behavior needs. And one of the problems that one of the earlier speakers had this very similar quote. Our numbers are a little different, but since 2000, 52% of the Fortune 500 are no longer on the list. So they didn't make this transition to continuous innovation. So this is a book by Rita Gunther McGrath. And so at this point, I would always pull out my phone and search on Amazon in the cloud, find out if it had good ratings, if the speaker was recommending something good. But she says that the world where a company figured out what their niche was, and like HP, I can pick on HP, I worked there. It's like HP figured out their niche was printing for a long time. And they were really good at making printers and really good at making ink. They made their money off the ink. And so they made their money off the ink, and they did it better than anybody else, and so they just kept making printers and ink, and they dominated that niche. That's no longer the way businesses can function in the future. So you can no longer pick a niche and just solve that niche. You will go out of business. You'll be one of the 52% who go out of business. The world of the future is figuring out what your customers need and evolving with them. So if your customers are buying lots of books, or they want more ebooks, or they're using Netflix and they want to watch movies in a different way, or they want to watch different content, the key to the future is evolving with your customers and being able to figure out what they need, so being able to communicate with them. And so if that's what companies are doing, what about individuals? We need to make sure that 52% of our high school graduating class doesn't end up not on the Fortune 500 list or whatever it is for individuals. And we need to make sure that even if they didn't get a computer science degree, that they understand the power that's out there and available to them. This is not individuals like those high school students, but one of the things we're doing at Cloud Foundry is trying to make sure that the non-technology companies, so the industries that typically would not play in creating software, that they get a voice. So this was a room full of bankers in New York, and they are talking to us about their requirements for Cloud Foundry. Nobody told me before I went that you were supposed to wear a blue button-up shirt when you got a financial meeting in New York. So I was the only woman and the only one not wearing a blue button-up shirt. So at Cloud Foundry, we see a world of cloud computing that's ubiquitous and flexible, so it supports private and public clouds. It's portable and interoperable, so it should be able to move wherever users or developers need it to move. And if you're on one cloud and for some reason you need to move to your own hosted cloud or to a different host, you should be able to do that. And it's vibrant and growing. So we want the whole world to be participating in this cloud movement and helping us define what it means to run things in the cloud and how does that impact what you can do and what your neighbors can do. The human community is a really important part of this because technology is created by humans. Our future is created by humans. And we see a human community that's pragmatic, so very practical, trying to solve real problems. We see a human community that's really diverse. We can't leave anybody behind, or we're going to create solutions that are not all they can be. And we see a community that's very respectful, that listens to each other and helps each other out. And it's a global phenomenon. So any talk you go to, I believe you should take away one thing, or you've wasted a half hour of your life. So take a moment here to reflect on what's the one thing you heard me say that kind of made an aha or will make you think of something later. And then I have an ask of you. Think of one way that you could do something today, preferably today or tomorrow, that would help show the power of this new internet cloud computing world to somebody who might not realize it. And that one thing may be a conversation you're going to have tonight over a beer. It could be you're going to go into your child's class next week and talk to them about what you do and maybe show them code.org or something. But think of one thing that you're going to do to help bring this power of the cloud to somebody who might not realize it. And then I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and tell them what that one thing is. I'm going to give you like 30 seconds. You actually have to turn to your neighbor and tell them what the one thing is. All right, thank you very much. I will be around all day and around for beers, so I will ask you what your one thing was. Thanks.
That reminded me of